Should you compost diseased leaves? I was watching the news last night and they had a guest on from a local nursery. And that person recommended that you should not compost leaves that have diseases on them. Why? Because you spread them all over the garden. That seems to make sense. And that is the advice I see all over the place. I don't agree with it, at least not 100%. Now, should you compost diseased leaves? Well, the answer to that isn't quite black and white. There are some cases where you probably shouldn't, but there are many other cases where you can compost those leaves. In this program, I'm going to have a close look at this topic. We'll take a look at some examples, we'll talk about the pros and cons, and then I'll give you some final advice on what you should do in the fall with those diseased leaves. Here are three common examples of leaves that have diseases, and I see these examples used a lot in online discussion. The first one is powdery mildew. This is a white cottony film that develops on leaves, and you'll see it on things like roses and lilacs. So what is powdery mildew? It's actually a fungi, or is it a fungi? This is an organism that develops spores very similar to seeds. They land on your plants, they germinate, and they send a little root-like structure into the leaf, and then they start sipping the juices of the leaves. So that does harm the plants. Powdery mildew is very common, and as gardeners we talk about a disease called powdery mildew. But it turns out that almost every plant in your garden that has this disease has a different disease. They just all happen to look the same, so we call them all powdery mildew. Another very common example that I see, and this is the one that was used on the newscast last night, is tar spots on maple trees. These are large, ugly black spots that develop usually later in the summer. They look really dangerous and they look horrible, and people don't want them. So should we compost those leaves? Well, it turns out those are also fungi that have infected the leaf. They just happen to look black instead of white. You find them a lot on Norway maples, but other maples also get tar spots. They just don't always look exactly the same. Another example that you're probably familiar with are tomato plants. By fall, they have all kinds of diseases, and two very common ones are early blight and septoria leaf spot. We're going to have a look at those in a little more detail later on in the program. Why do people say that we shouldn't compost these leaves? Well, the spores survive on the leaves and inside the tissue. And then in spring, they come out and infect other plants. So by leaving the leaves in your garden, you're spreading the disease for next year. The other problem we have is that if you compost these leaves, a lot of the fungi spore will survive. So even when the compost is finished, we still have a whole bunch of spores in the compost. And then you spread that around, spreading the disease. So it's better off not to compost. But there are some problems with this advice. All right, it sounds like cleaning up these leaves is a good idea. But let's look at some other facts. The first one is that by fall, you have fungal spores everywhere. They're on every leaf. Even if it hasn't infected that leaf, the spores are there. They're on the soil, they're on the sidewalk, they're everywhere in your garden. So taking a couple leaves that have visible signs of the disease and taking them out of your garden doesn't get rid of the spores. There's still lots there. Let's have a look around and see some of these fall leaves. This is an ash tree, and it has all kinds of spots on it. Yep, all the leaves are diseased. Good luck picking all of these up off the ground and getting rid of them. Now this one doesn't have large spots, but you can see lots of tiny little spots here. This is a grapevine. Look at all the spots here. The leaves on this elderberry actually look pretty good. But there's the odd one, got lots of spots. European buckthorn. There's a tree that we need to get rid of, but even it has spots. And remember, these fungal infections here, they look terrible this time of the year, but they're not harming this plant. This plant is a noxious weed, and we need to get it out of the garden. Here's an ash tree that's not doing too well. Probably got hit by the ash borer. But what happens with these trees is they start sprouting from the bottom. And so let's have a look at these leaves. Yeah, some spots. They look pretty clean actually, but you'll see some spots, and you'll also see this yellowing. This is intervenochlorosis. There's one of the nutrients that's missing, and it's probably not iron. There's lots of things that cause intervenochlorosis. Another very common myth that you'll find on the internet. There's another important fact, and that is that these spores, they travel long distances. Powdery mildew spores, when they're created, they kind of get puffed into the air, and they can spread hundreds of miles. Wheat rust can travel 1,200 miles. So if you clean up your garden perfectly and you have no spores whatsoever, next spring and summer, those spores are flying in from all the neighboring gardens. There's actually a field of science called bioballistics. And what this group of people look at is how these spores get spread around. Because if we had a single spore and we popped it up into the air, it wouldn't travel that far. But when the spores are released in large numbers, it's kind of like an explosion, and they're puffed up into the air. And each one of these spores helps the other one travel faster. If you're familiar with bike riders like to go one behind the other because there's a drafting effect. For the second one can travel much farther because he's getting the draft from the front one. Now, I know on the highway they like to travel side by side, but in races they're always one behind the other. The fact that there are lots of spores being created actually helps propel them even farther. What about this black tar that's on maple tree? Well, you could collect every leaf in your garden and get rid of it, but unless you do that for the whole town and everyone collects their leaves, it's going to be back next year. It doesn't really matter how hard you work at getting rid of these diseased leaves, they're coming in from the neighborhood. There's one other really important point here, and that is that in fall, almost every plant has some sort of infection, either a fungal infection or a bacterial infection. Now, you might not see the infection, but most leaves do have them. So if the rule is, let's not compost diseased leaves, what that means is we don't compost anything. We'd have to take all of the dead vegetation in our garden and get rid of it. We'd have nothing left to compost. And that really doesn't make a lot of sense. All right, well, it sounds like you should compost everything, but there are some exceptions. Let's have a look at the diseases on tomato plants. One is called septorial leaf spot, and the other one is early blight. And quite honestly, most gardeners mix those two up and just call them blight. What happens is that mid-season and later on, you get all kinds of spots on your tomato leaves. You can distinguish between those two diseases, but I'll let you research the actual symptoms for these. Both are fungal infections, and both behave similarly in the garden. They infect the leaves and stems, and they overwinter in that vegetation. So as spores alone, they don't overwinter very well in cold climates. But when they're inside the plant actually protects those spores. And even though the tomato plant is dead in the winter, it's that dead tissue that's protecting the spores. And that's where they overwinter. So if you leave a lot of that vegetation laying around, or if you partially compost it and bring it back, then you have the disease coming back to your tomatoes. So one of the things you can do is gather up your tomatoes from your vegetable garden and put them somewhere else in the garden. They'll still compost over there. Now you might be thinking, well, but in spring all those spores will go into the air and affect your tomato plants. But it turns out that these two diseases have spores that don't travel by wind. They don't go very far. Most of the traveling done by these spores is done by splashing water. And that's why we have advice for tomato growers is to not water the plants, because the water running down the plants and hitting the soil disturbs the soil, and the spores in the soil come up and splash onto the plants. You reduce that by using mulch so we don't have soil spreading up, and by getting rid of the vegetation so it's not decomposing in the soil where you're planting tomatoes. Now, the bottom line is that it's pretty hard to get rid of this disease. I've been growing tomatoes for 45 some years, and I've always had it. And for a few years there, I cleaned up my garden so well, and I got rid of all that vegetation, and I still ended up with the disease. Now, the good news about this disease is that it doesn't really kill the plant, and it doesn't deform the fruit, so you can still pick good tomatoes. So I don't really worry about the disease that much. And that's an important point. You should always understand the disease and understand how much damage does that really cause in the garden. Powdery mildew is like that too. It rarely kills a plant and doesn't really do a lot of damage. So we can live with powdery mildew, not really an issue. But there are some things we don't want to live with. And one of those is a virus. Once a plant has a virus, it spreads throughout the plant and can live in that tissue at least for a little while. It may even survive composting. So if you have a plant with a virus, get it out of your property. Don't compost it. Don't leave it laying around. You have to get rid of it. Now, the virus may not kill the plant, but in some cases it will. So a virus is something we really don't want around in the garden. Let's talk about a disease called Aster Yellow. It's not very common in gardens, but it does show up from time to time. You'll recognize it by having very yellow leaves and stunted growth. This is not a fungi, it's actually a bacterial infection. But once a plant is infected, there's no cure. This plant will eventually die from the disease. But it's kind of an interesting disease. It's spread by the Aster's leafhopper, which is a little insect that comes along and chews the leaves and then goes on a different plant and chews that leaf and spreads the disease. If you take the leaves from one of these plants and compost it, you won't spread the disease. In fact, the disease doesn't overwinter very well in the vegetation. So all of the above ground leaves can be collected and just left on the ground over winter, and it won't infect next year's plants. But the bacteria can survive in the crown of the plant and in the roots. So if this is a perennial, it overwinters that way. Now, next year, this perennial will be weaker, but perennials can survive a couple years before they die. Next year, they start to grow, and the leafhopper comes along, chews on them, collects some of the bacteria, and takes it off to a healthy plant and infects that one. So we do want to get rid of the roots and the crown of the plant and get rid of that. Don't compost that. But composting the leaves isn't an issue. And what about this leafhopper? Is he going to survive the winter? And does he spread the disease? Well, not really. It turns out this leafhopper doesn't like the cold, so it flies south for the winter, just like the monarchs. And by the time he comes back, he's generally gotten rid of the bacterium, so he's not infectious the next year. It's one of these cases where composting the leaves aren't a problem, even though they have the disease, but the roots and the crown shouldn't be composted. And by the way, Aster Yellow affects a lot of different plants, including garlic. One of the reasons I want to talk about this disease is not because you're bound to see a lot of it, but it's a good example of why it's so important for you to actually identify the disease you're talking about and then understand its biology. And once you understand that, you can make intelligent decisions in the garden. All right, this all sounds very complicated. Let's simplify it. Should you compost diseased leaves? Well, the answer is yes. Most of the diseases you have in your garden are going to be there next year, whether you compost the leaves or not. And the reason is that the spores are everywhere in your garden, and they're everywhere in the neighbor's garden, and next year, if you don't have any, which is impossible, they're going to come in anyway. So don't worry about it. In most cases, compost that material. Get some value out of the organic matter that your garden produced. There are cases where you shouldn't compost them. And as you become a more experienced gardener, it's important for you to start identifying these problem diseases like viruses. You should know what a hosta virus looks like because I know a lot of you grow hostas. Aster Yellow is another one. Learn to identify the disease. And if you have some of these diseases and you understand the diseases, you'll know exactly what to do. In the case of viruses, get rid of the plant. Always. But the general advice online to not compost diseased leaves, that makes no sense at all. Now, if you'd like to learn more about composting, I have two great videos for you. The first one here is 27 composting myths. And the second one, which is actually one of my most popular videos, is how do you make compost faster and better? How do you make really good quality compost? Happy gardening. See you in the next video.